Good morning. In this session, I'll be focusing on questions and answers to review the nervous system, and I'll start by sharing the screen on some slides of the PowerPoint presentation. First of all, I'll open a new screen or a white screen in order to remind you of the components of the nervous system. So if I ever ask you to write like or draw like a graphic organizer or a flow chart of the components of the nervous system, so you would start by saying that the nervous system consists of the central nervous system and the peripheral nervous system. The central nervous system consists of the brain above and the spinal cord below, which is an extension of the brain, and the brain consists of the cerebrum. And in addition to the cerebrum, we have the cerebellum, which is now considered a separate part of the brain because of its importance, as well as the brain stem, And the cerebrum consists of a right and left cerebral halves or cerebral hemispheres. The brainstem, as you know, consists of the midbrain above, and then we have the pons varolai, and then we have the medulla oblongata, okay, the lowermost part. And of course, the cerebellum is connected to the brainstem and connected to the cerebrum. Concerning the peripheral nervous system, the peripheral nervous system consists of cranial nerves that arise from the brain. We have 12 pairs of cranial nerves, as well as the spinal nerves that arise from the spinal cord. And it's worth noting that spinal nerves are all mixed, meaning that they contain both sensory and motor nerve fibers, whereas the cranial nerves can be either purely motor or purely sensory or sometimes mixed. Okay, now we are ready to see the structure of the brain, and I'm keen on giving you questions on those slides and those diagrams because you don't have a practical test this year, and we are going to include the practical questions in the test, in the final test. So the first question here, I might get this diagram and ask you, for example, about this picture to the right, and ask you which surface of the brain is this? So you would say it is the superior surface. How can I know that this is a superior surface? By the presence of this deep sulcus or groove that extends from the posterior part of the brain, which is called the occipital pole, to the anterior part of the brain, which is called the anterior pole or frontal pole. Okay, so here we have the frontal pole or anterior pole, and here we have the posterior pole or occipital pole. And you can see no other structures or no structures other than the right cerebral hemisphere and the left cerebral hemisphere. Why did I consider this right? Because I imagine that I'm looking at the brain from above. Then I might ask you about these elevations and depressions of the brain. So, of course, you know that every elevation is called a gyrus, and the plural is gyri, and every depression is called a sulcus. And you know from the previous video that gyri and sulci are here in order to increase the surface area and therefore allow more neurons to be there for more efficiency and more accuracy of sending orders and more accuracy of receiving sensory information. If I ever ask you about that surface, you would see that it is the lateral surface of the brain. And in this lateral surface, we can see the frontal pole that belongs, of course, to the frontal lobe. We can see the occipital pole that belongs to the occipital lobe. And we can see a lateral view of the cerebellum. By the way, here the cerebellum is not visible, but there is a part of the spinal cord or of the brain that is visible here, and that makes you know that this is the posterior pole. Furthermore, as you can see, the anterior pole is less wide than the posterior pole, and here you can have a wider area, but the most accurate determinant of this being the posterior pole, that you can invert the brain a little bit and make sure that the cerebellum is there and that the brainstem is there, because the cerebellum is present at the posterior end of the brain. And of course, this is the pons varolii, this is the medulla oblongata. We cannot see the midbrain easily in a lateral view, and then the lower extension is the spinal cord. Here you can see this lateral lobe that is called the temporal lobe. Here you can see a sulcus, okay, and that sulcus is called the central sulcus. We will see it clearly on the next slides, and the central sulcus separates the frontal lobe anteriorly from the parietal lobe posteriorly, and then we have another sulcus here that is called parieto-occipital sulcus. If I ever ask you about these three sulci, I might label them 1, 2, 3. 1 is the central sulcus. What demarcation is it? It separates the frontal lobe from the parietal lobe. 2 is the parieto-occipital sulcus. It is called according to the names of the lobes anteriorly and posteriorly, parieto-occipital sulcus. And 3 is the lateral sulcus, okay? Can we see them on the superior surface? Yani other than the longitudinal fissure, can we see them? Yes, we can partly see the top view of the central sulcus, meaning that that central sulcus can be seen above. Not only is it seen on the central sulcus, is not only seen on the lateral surface, but it can also be seen on the superior surface. So if I ever ask you about the number of major grooves that you can see on the superior surface, you would say the longitudinal sulcus and the central sulcus. This is the lateral view from the left side. The lateral view from the right side is the same. You can see here the frontal lobe. You can see here the temporal lobe. You can see the occipital lobe. You can see after the frontal lobe here. This is it's difficult. The sulci are not very visible on the diagram. So here we have the lateral sulcus, and here we have the central sulcus. So this is the parietal lobe, and this is the frontal lobe, or maybe a little bit anteriorly, okay? What about the inferior surface? I might ask you, what surface is this? It is a theoretical test, but you have a question that makes you imagine what you have studied in your session on dissection. So this is the inferior surface. Again, this is the frontal pole, or the frontal lobe or the anterior-most part of the frontal lobe. And then here, this is the cerebellum. But we cannot see on the inferior surface. It's difficult to see the occipital lobe, but you already know that the cerebellum covers the occipital pole. What is characteristic of the inferior surface is, first of all, that we can see the inferior surface of the cerebellum that consists of two hemispheres, right cerebellar hemisphere, left cerebellar hemisphere, and in between them, we have a structure. So it looks like a butterfly, like this. It has horizontal sulci and therefore horizontal gyri. And in the middle, you have a part that's called the vermis, and that is hidden by the brain stem. And here, of course, you can see the spinal cord. You can see, I'm giving you the labels from different aspects. You can see the medulla oblongata, you can see the pons above, and a very deep portion of the midbrain. So here you have the pons varoli, and here this is the optic nerve, and you will see it clearly. This is what we call the optic chiasma, and it's a decussation of the optic nerve. So just I'll just label it here, and then we will discuss it later on. طبعا behind the frontal lobe, we have the parietal lobe and the temporal lobe. But what is seen here is the lowermost part of the temporal lobe. Yani this temporal lobe has an extension or on the inferior surface of the brain. Okay, now we can see the inferior surface clearly. Imagine that this is the lower surface of the brain, and here we have the anterior end. I might ask you where the anterior end is. The anterior end, again, is what we call the frontal pole, and the posterior end is where the cerebellum is. If you cannot see, is where, what happened? The pen is getting mad. Okay. So this is the posterior pole or the occipital pole. And imagine that this is the anterior end. So you have the eyes here, okay? The eyes under the frontal part of the brain. And if you look at the brain laterally like this, so this is the base of the skull and your eyes are here. So the optic nerve passes like this, and this is what we call the optic tract. Here you can see the two, sorry, not here. Where is it? The optic tract. Okay, this is, sorry, I'm sorry. I'll erase. So here, this is actually the olfactory tract that is responsible for carrying olfactory sensation or smell sensation. But actually, we have here the optic nerve, but it's cut. That's why I got confused. The optic nerve arises from each eye, and then here we have what we call optic chiasma. They decussate together, chiasma, and then after the chiasma, we have what we call the optic tract. So here you have the optic nerve, and then you have this crisscrossing, which is the optic chiasma, and then you have the optic tract, and the optic tract is supposed to go to the occipital lobe. طبعا we cannot see the occipital lobe here because it's hidden under the cerebellum. Okay, what are these? These are cranial nerves. You are not supposed, طبعا, of course, to know what cranial nerves arises from where, but just if I ever label one of these, you just say it is a cranial nerve. Okay, moving on to the next slide. This is the central sulcus, but seen from above, and therefore, since this is the central sulcus, I might ask you, what lobe is this? You would say the frontal lobe. And what lobe is that? It is the parietal lobe. This one, just behind the central sulcus, okay? Parietal lobe. But if I label lower down like this, I wouldn't tell, and it's very difficult for you to identify the temporal lobe from the superior surface. The temporal lobe is on the lateral surface and inferiorly, lateral and inferiorly. It's كده appearing, a very small part of the temporal lobe is appearing here. If you look at that diagram, this is, of course, again, what surface is it? It is the lateral surface. What structures can you see? You can see the frontal lobe, you can see the parietal lobe, you can see the occipital lobe, you can see the temporal lobe. So frontal lobe, and then parietal lobe, and then temporal lobe, occipital lobe. And then we have the temporal lobe, and then we have the cerebellum. Which sulcus is this? It is the central sulcus. What does it separate? It separates the frontal lobe in front of it or anteriorly from the parietal lobe posteriorly. What is this? It is the lateral sulcus. The lateral sulcus actually separates the frontal lobe from the temporal lobe and the parietal lobe from the temporal lobe. And here we have a small sulcus that separates the parietal lobe from the occipital lobe, and it is called parieto-occipital sulcus, okay? Here, of course, you have, again, the longitudinal fissure. Here we can see some important centers on the brain. I might get you the picture without taban, the labels on it. So here, if I might get you the picture and tell you to highlight the central sulcus. So this is the central sulcus. And if it's not already labeled on the diagram, I label or highlight this is another question, highlight the lateral sulcus, then you would do this and you would write here that this is the lateral sulcus. And then I might repeat the same questions. What is a sulcus? What does this particular sulcus separate, or where does it lie? It lies between what and what. فنخلي بالنا بس من lateral sulcus إنه it's not only between the frontal lobe and the temporal lobe, but it's also between the parietal lobe and the temporal lobe. And then I might ask you about the main centers that are present in every lobe. فمثلا, coming to the frontal lobe, we have, of course, the motor area. So this is the voluntary motor area. زي ما قلنا إنه الموtor area, you of course all know the function of the voluntary motor area. It sends motor impulses to the opposite side of the body. Why to the opposite side of the body? Because at the level of the medulla oblongata, there is a decussation that occurs in the descending motor fibers. I might ask you again, which are called the pyramidal fibers. I might ask you about other centers like this one that we will see on other slides. This is called the premotor area. And actually, it's not only, truly speaking, it's not only the premotor area, but also the motor association area. Motor association area, meaning that the premotor area is, as I told you, very developed in primates, and in monkeys, it has been proved to be very developed. And the premotor area is responsible for planning for movements, meaning that for a monkey, for example, if he sees a banana on a tree, so he would think rapidly and plan movements, how to reach the banana, what's the easier way to reach the banana. So planning movements, motor movements, of course, organizing movements. And this is very useful, of course, in learning movements, imitation, and all this kind of things that monkeys do. And this is what is meant by an association area, how to coordinate motor movements together. Of course, you will hear the word coordination in several areas of the brain, because you don't think, if a particular center of the brain is responsible for a particular function, then this function would not be present in other areas. In the most anterior part, we have the prefrontal area or the prefrontal cortex. And we say cortex because the gray matter is the most highly specialized part of the brain. The prefrontal cortex is responsible, as we said before, for logical thinking, for solving problems, for making decisions, and it's also responsible for the behavior and the personality of the human being. And it's also responsible for the memory of habits. So the prefrontal cortex is responsible for logical thinking. It is responsible for decisions, it is responsible for planning. احنا قلنا planning قبل كده بس in the premotor area it was planning for motor movements. What kind of motor movement should I do? Which motor movement would be the best to reach a particular site? But here we're talking about virtual, not virtual, I'm sorry, but how do we call it? I can't remember. Yani planning for your future brain actions, okay? But it is responsible for the personality of the individual, for your reactions, your attitude, and the memory of habits. A good part, memory of habits in particular. يعني طبعا memory برضو من الحاجات whose centers are widespread. يعني I don't know whether we will have enough time to study how memory works in the brain. It's one of the mysterious areas of the brain, but at least we know some information about this, but I'm not sure whether we'll be able to do this or not, but the centers for memory are widespread in the brain. So if I ever ask you, what would happen if the frontal lobe is injured? It depends upon the site of injury. But of course, if the whole frontal lobe is injured, then you would lose the functions of the voluntary motor actions and you would have hemiplegia on the other side. You would, in some conditions where we have brain tumors that are compressing only the prefrontal area, we might have difficulty in analyzing, difficulty in logical thinking, difficulty in making decisions, and we might forget habits, ritual habits like making coffee, as I told you, or driving a bike or whatever, or driving a car, riding a bike, or driving a car. Concerning the parietal lobe, of course, you have to know that it contains the sensory area and the sensory association area. The sensory area helps you feel the sensation, but the sensory association area helps you understand what you felt or perceived. But the parietal lobe is also important because it contains something related to speech. The parietal lobe and the frontal lobe are involved not only in speech, but in learning. So as we said before, I will erase the information on the screen first. As we said before, Broca's area is the motor area of speech that is responsible for coordination of the articulators, motor area of speech that is responsible not for initiating the motor order. I mean, if it were responsible for initiation, then if Broca's area was injured, we would be totally paralyzed in this area. No, but the muscles are not paralyzed. When you have injury of Broca's area, which is the motor area of speech, it is responsible for coordination of the articulator muscles, like the lip muscles, like the tongue muscles, and so on, as you know, and therefore we would have a kind of aphasia. Aphasia means difficulty speaking. That is called motor aphasia. And motor aphasia, in motor aphasia, you understand very well, you can form ideas very well, but you have difficulty in articulating speech. On the other hand, Wernicke's area that lies midway between the parietal lobe and the temporal lobe is responsible for sensory speech, and therefore if it's injured, you would have sensory aphasia, meaning that you would have difficulty synthesizing ideas of speech. You would be very fluent, by the way, talking, because you don't have a problem in coordination, but you would give nonsense speech because of the ideas themselves are distorted. In Broca's aphasia, which is a motor kind of aphasia, the lack of coordination is not in the articulator muscles only, but also in the small muscles of the hand. So they have difficulty writing well and writing on the lines. In the temporal lobe, we have a very important center, which is the auditory center, and every sensory center is associated with its association center. You hear, and then you understand what you hear. Here we can also have a fifth lobe that is hidden, and I'll be showing it on the next slides, and it is called the insula. And in the part of, why am I saying this on the slide? Because part of your taste is controlled here in the under the temporal lobe and part under the frontal lobe. Why am I saying under? لأنه taste centers are present in the fifth lobe of the brain. We have the frontal lobe, we have the temporal lobe, we have the parietal lobe, we have the occipital lobe, and there is a fifth hidden lobe in between the frontal lobe and the temporal lobe. You can only see it with a retractor. That is called the insula, and the insula contains the taste centers or the gustatory center. طبعا of course plus الassociation بتاعته اللي هو in order to understand what we taste. So the gustatory is present in the insula, and the insula is partly under the temporal lobe and partly under the frontal lobe. But the insula is responsible for other functions. If I ever ask you about the main centers in the occipital lobe, you will say vision center plus association center. I might ask you, هو الvision center that is connected to which nerve? It is connected to the optic nerve. Concerning that, the olfactory tract that you saw here on the undersurface of the brain, and that is coming from the nose and that carries smell sensation to the olfactory center. The olfactory center actually lies on the inferior surface of the frontal lobe and on the inferior surface of the temporal lobe. فبتبقوا confused شوية لأن في references بتقول inferior surface of the temporal lobe وفي references تانية بتقول the inferior surface of the frontal lobe. Okay. Here you can see the insula. Yani this purple part is the insula, and see here, for example, they consider that the olfactory area is in this area of the temporal lobe. Actually, it is on the inferior surface of the frontal lobe and in or on the inferior surface of the temporal lobe. Here you can see the insula, and in the insula you can see the gustatory cortex, and they call it cortex لأنه some references consider that the insula is not a separate lobe, but it's just gray matter. Here, of course, you have the sensory area, sensory association area, vision, vision center, and vision association center, and this is the temporal lobe. Here we have taken a coronal section of the brain, and if you cut the brain like cold cuts, it would be a coronal section of the brain. طبعا what you see in red here is the motor area, and what you see in blue is the sensory area. And here we have another important structure, and the motor area and the sensory area are separated by the central, on the lateral surface, they are separated by the central sulcus. So the central sulcus separates the motor area anteriorly. This is motor area anteriorly, and that lies in the frontal lobe, from the sensory area posteriorly, and that lies in the parietal lobe. This is if you are looking at the lateral surface. But if you are taking a coronal section, like you do with cold cuts, if you are taking a coronal section, then this is, and if I ever ask you to label this, you would see you would say that this is the longitudinal fissure, of course, and then here we have, no, actually this is not, I think I'm not sure whether this is a coronal section or not, because they are if it were the coronal section, it would be at the same plane, same coronal plane. وبالتالي on both sides, I would be taking the section at, this is very weird. Yeah, this diagram is not, it is good as a representative diagram for the areas of the brain, but you got my point. Yeah, if this is a fissure that gives you the motor anteriorly and the sensory posteriorly, then it is supposed to be the lateral fissure. If it is the longitudinal fissure, what does this mean? It means that this is one cerebral hemisphere, this is the other cerebral hemisphere. So if I take a coronal section like this, if I take a coronal section like this, and then look at the slice I obtained from the coronal section and see that it is like this, it should be sensory on both sides. يعني لو ده parietal هيبقى ده parietal، لو ده frontal هيبقى ده frontal، unless بقى انهم يكونوا واخدين السكشن كده، يعني ده يبقى right cerebral hemisphere وده left cerebral hemisphere، وادي السنترال sulcus وادي موتور سنسوري، فهو واخد السكشن كده اهو، بحيث انه في ناحيه يبقى عندك موتور وفي ناحيه يبقى عندك سنسوري. anyways احنا لما هنبص على ال representation of the body, see how the body is represented. It is represented سواء في الموتور area، برضه this is a very important question، انه the human body is represented upside down. The human body is represented upside down. Upside down. يعني ايه upside down؟ يعني احنا المفروض our head is superior و our lower limbs are inferior. هنا احنا عندنا the head is inferior and the lower limbs are superior، سواء بالنسبة للسنسوري area أو بالنسبة للموتور area. معنى كده إيه الكلام ده؟ معناها إن أنا لو عندي نيورون بينقل لي أو ريسبتور مثلا بينقل لي sorry I'll erase this. Sorry. مش عايز يقريس، مش مشكلة. طيب أنا لو عندي sensory receptor مثلا كده وبينقل لي sensation from the face، يبقى it will reach this area. لكن لو الريسبتور ده بينقل لي sensation from the lower limbs يبقى هيوصل هنا. طبعا هيوصل along the spinal cord، مش بالعرض كده يعني، تمام؟ ف this is what we mean by the human body is represented upside down. إنه information coming from the face will reach the lowermost part of the sensory area, whereas information coming from the lower limbs اللي هم أصلاً lower هيوصلوا in the uppermost part. This is exactly the representation. يبقى أول حاجة بنستنتجها من ده إنه the human body is represented upside down. تاني حاجة بنستنتجها إنه as you see شايفين السيرفيس اريا اللي الفيس واخداها سواء بالنسبه للسنسوري او بالنسبه للموتور. There is a large area that is dedicated to the face. مش بس to the face، الفيس بكل ما فيها بقى والماوث والتونج. فعلا اكتر sensory nerves مثلا يعني density موجوده around the lips، اكتر muscles بتتحرك ومحتاجه accuracy of movement هي يعني ال speech muscles. But see how this area of the body is important. بعد كده هنا في الميديال سيرفيس بنتكلم عن ده المنظر الحقيقي للميديال سيرفيس. فبنشوف هنا الستراكشرز اللي اسمها the limbic system. كل الكولرد ستراكشرز دي اسمها the limbic system. والحقيقه الليمبيك سيستم معمول من structures انا I'm not keen قوي ان انتوا تعرفوا the names of the components of the limbic system، بس احنا هنتكلم عن a few elements of them. اولا انه the limbic system in general is concerned with our emotions وكمان with memory of emotions. يعني ايه memory of emotions؟ يعني لو انا رحت مكان مثلا and it was a beautiful place وكل حاجة، بس يعني مثلا a bad incident happened in that place، فالmemory will be kept. يعني this place will always be correlated to that bad memory however the place is beautiful. The limbic system is considered for emotions, for memory of emotions, for our emotional reactions. يعني are they negative or positive emotional reactions. It's also important for our attitude towards people and towards event. It is طبعا very important in learning لأنه it contains centers for reward and centers to feel stress. Well, importance is clear لأنه طبعا you know that dopamine is one of the major hormones that are responsible for rewards sensation, meaning that if you are appreciated, for example, there is dopamine that is released into your brain and that makes you feel happy. And this happiness you feel is due to this neurotransmitter, this chemical, but it gives you a sensation that is pleasant and that makes you pursue the good work and the achievement, and that makes you endure and withstand the difficulties. So this is the importance of the reward hormone dopamine. What does dopamine do? Just like any drug that makes happiness, it minimizes pain, it makes you feel relaxed, it slows down the heart rate. I mean, you know, happiness and stress can be converted into or translated into biological and physiological actions of the body. So why do I feel happy, for example, when I see somebody I love? Because dopamine or oxytocin are released. What is happiness on a biological ground? Happiness is physiological reactions of the body, like relaxed muscles, so diminution of pain, diminution of the heart rate, just like when you're sleeping, when you're floating on the surface of the water. So happiness and stress can be converted into or translated into functions of the organs. And this is how we can understand abstract things in the context or in using biological functions. On the other hand, stress is not all bad. Stress is a double weapon because stress makes you, when you're stressed out and there is adrenaline and noradrenaline that are released from the brain as a reflex to what you have seen a lion, you have seen a road accident, whatever thing that is stressful makes you release adrenaline and noradrenaline, cortisol. Partly they help you withstand the stress, and partly they prevent you repetition of the same mistakes. In the limbic system, we also have the amygdaloid body, and the amygdaloid body is responsible for controlling or is related, not controlling, it is related to your fear, your aggressiveness. And there were experiments that were done on the amygdala, once stimulating it, once removing it, and to see how this would make the animal more aggressive or less aggressive, feeling more fear or feeling less fear. And then we have the thalamus, and as I told before, the thalamus is considered the secretary of the brain. This is where relay of all sensory and motor information is done, meaning that all sensory fibers ascending to the brain, or motor fibers descending from the brain will pass through the thalamus. And then of course you have the hypothalamus, and if I ever ask you about the hypothalamus, of course, is one of the important questions, because the hypothalamus is responsible for sleep, regulating appetite, regulating water intake and thirst. It is also important for controlling the secretion of the pituitary gland. By the way, as I told you before, sleep, appetite, and mood are related to each other. So if you are depressed, you might oversleep or undersleep. You might have insomnia. If you have a disturbance, you are in a mood or in a bad mood, then you would overeat or undereat. How is the hypothalamus connected to the pituitary gland? This is also an important question. The hypothalamus is connected to both the anterior lobe and the posterior lobe of the pituitary gland, as I said before. So if this is the anterior lobe of the pituitary gland, and this is the posterior lobe of the pituitary gland. I'm talking about the pituitary gland and the hypothalamus. The neurons of the hypothalamus are connected to the pituitary gland. So you can consider this a hypothalamic pituitary axis, this part, okay? See how the terminal ends of the neurons of the hypothalamus are connected to the anterior and posterior lobes of the thyroid, of the pituitary gland. This is the pituitary gland. The anterior lobe of the pituitary gland secretes releasing and inhibitory hormones. يعني for example, بالنسبة للthyroid gland, it secretes thyroid stimulating hormone, TSH, and thyroid inhibitory hormone. It's either this or that, يعني it might increase this or that. They circulate into blood to reach the thyroid gland, and therefore they can either increase the secretion of the hormones of the thyroid gland, T3 and T4, or diminish the secretion of T3 and T4. This is one example. So what does the hypothalamus do? The hypothalamus releases hormones like these that are called releasing hormones. So we have thyrotropin releasing hormone. You needn't know that name, but you have to know best in these neurosecretions that are secreted from the hypothalamus will affect the hormones of the anterior pituitary to increase their secretion or decrease their secretion. So what about the posterior pituitary? The posterior pituitary is different. يعني anterior pituitary هي بتعمل its own secretions. هي بتعمل TSH و TIH بس هم تحت رحمة الريليسنج هرمون بتاع الهايبوثالاموس. لو الريليسنج هرمون طلع كتير الثايرويد ستيميوليتنج هرمون هيزيد، لو طلع قليل هيقل. اما بالنسبه للبوستيريور لوب اوف ذا بيتويتري جلاند هي مشهوره بايه البوستيريور لوب؟ اوكسيتوسين، فاكرينه اللي هو اللاف هرمون من ناحيه، يعني الاوكسيتوسين اهو بيطلع من البوستيريور لوب اوف ذا بيتويتري جلاند. هو مش بس لاف هرمون، هو مهم في اللاكتيشن وفي الدليفري اوف نيو بورن انفانتس، لانه الاوكسيتوسين بيعمل contraction of the ducts of the mammary glands فيحصل release of milk. release، هو مش بيعمل الميلك بس بيريليس الميلك from the ducts of the mammary glands، وكمان بيروح لليوترس يعمل stimulation of contraction. وعشان كده زمان لما كان بيبقى فيه difficult labor والuterine contractions are very weak كانوا يدوا injection of oxytocin عشان to stimulate the contraction. طبعا الأم تاخدها من هنا تصوت من هنا لأن الuterine contractions دي كانت بتعمل severe pain. نفس الكلام أول ما النيو بورن يتاتش النيبل of the mom يحصل reflex release of oxytocin from the posterior pituitary gland. لكن هي كمان مشهورة بالانتي دايوريتيك هرمون. لو لاحظتوا أنا بقول إيه؟ بقول release of oxytocin أو release of antidiuretic hormone. ليه ما قلتش secretion؟ لأن posterior pituitary أصلاً does not secrete them. أمال مين اللي بيسكريت them؟ They are neurosecretions. They are neuro secretions from the hypothalamus. أمال posterior pituitary كل دورها إيه؟ إنهم يدخلوا في الveins of the في venous circulation of the posterior pituitary and then they go to the systemic circulation. تمام؟ Here this is how it looks يعني limbic system. Okay. وهنا طبعا this is a picture as you know of this is a coronal section of the brain زي ما قلنا قبل كده، والcoronal section of the brain دي احنا شايفين فيها الجراي cortex that is mainly made of بصفة عامة أي gray matter هتلاقوها في الدنيا سواء في البرين أو في spinal cord هتبقى عبارة عن cell bodies وهتبقى عبارة عن dendrites that are connected to the cell bodies وهتبقى عبارة عن the unmyelinated parts of the axons that are not covered by a myelin sheath. On the other hand احنا هنا عندنا the white matter اللي هي أساساً عبارة عن bundles of thick myelinated fibers. وطبعا they are very rapidly conducting, whether these myelinated fibers are sensory ascending or motor and descending. يعني أحيانا ممكن تلاقي إنه here you have the cell body if I enlarge والunmyelinated part وبعدين أول ما ينزل هنا في الوايت matter يبقى myelinated. تمام؟ These are the parts of the cerebellum وهنا these are the parts of the brainstem. As you see, the medulla oblongata is continuous with the spinal cord. This is the pons. This is the pons varoli. This is the midbrain and this is the thalamus. يعني it is another view. لكن هنا انتوا شايفين ان هم عاملين outline dotted لان it's deep inside the substance of the brain. By the way, الثالاموس يعني is ovoid كده like an egg وبيعمل like a T-shaped structure with the brain stem. هنا في حاجة مهمة قوي بقى، يعني احنا دايما بنقول انه الميدولا زي ما انتم عارفين فيها البريذنج سنتر والهارت سنتر وفيها السنتر فور سنيزنج، سنتر فور كافينج، سنتر فور swallowing، لكن فيها الميدولا والبونز هما الاثنين فيها مجموعة كده من النيورونز اسمهم the reticular formation. والreticular formation is responsible for arousal. يعني انت لو reticular formation دي is not working طبعا if you take general anesthesia that suppresses the cortex of the brain and the higher centers برضو you will not be conscious. برضو reticular formation is very important for arousal. هي موجودة deep in the substance of the medulla oblongata and the pons. شايفين وصل لها input منين؟ وصل لها input from touch receptors, from pain receptors, from temperature receptors. عارفين معنى الكلام ده ايه؟ وبعدين خلينا بس قبل ما نشوف معنى الكلام ده ايه. It also receives inputs from the ear and it receives inputs from the eye. كل دي عبارة عن ايه؟ sensory inputs. طب لما توصل لها sensory inputs دي هتعمل ايه؟ هي بقى هتودي مش هنقول عليها motor inputs بس هنقول عليها efferent inputs. فاكرين زي في الكدني كده، يعني arising from the reticular system to the gray cortex عشان تصحصح بقى الجراي كورتكس وتخلي الهاير centers of the brain of thinking وتبتدي بقى تشتغل. معنى الكلام ده ايه؟ معنى الكلام ده انه حضرتك لو حد فتح النور عندك turn light on او فتح الستاره، تمام، او حد عمل نويز جنبك وانت نايم، او حد مسكك وانت نايم قاعد يهز فيك كده فالتاتش، او دلق عليك ميه ساقعه مثلا for example، او قرصك يعني اي stimulus coming from the soma يعني pain touch. شوف بقى انت عايز تعمل ايه عشان تصحي اللي قدامك دوت، او ان حد عمل دوشه، او ان النور ولع. فكل دي afferent impulses بتروح للريتيكولار سيستم وهو يبعت efferent impulses اللي هو طوارئ بقى emergency. تبتدي بقى ايه تصحى وتتخض ونبضك يسرع وتفتكر الاساينمنت بتاع البيولوجي وتفتكر الاساينمنت بتاع السبجكتس الثانيه and everything starts working on. تمام. نفس الكلام بيحصل when the effect of anesthesia is diminished in the blood. هنا اللي طبعا الدايجرام is clear. It shows you the cardiac center and the respiratory center. شايفين respiratory center زي ما قلت لكم في two respiratory centers في البونز، يعني مش بس في الميدولا يعني في واحد في البونز وفي في الاريا between the pons and the medulla oblongata. بس طبعا المين respiratory center is in the medulla oblongata اللي هو ده. دولت actually they are two centers زي ما قلت قبل كده. They control the depth of inspiration and the initiation and termination of respiration. وبعدين في vasomotor center that regulates the tone of the blood vessels mainly the tone of the arterioles وبالتالي it controls the blood pressure. طبعا دولت احنا قلناهم قبل كده. This is a section in the spinal cord. Here these are طبعا لو انا قلت لكم ايه ده هتقولوا لي this is a reflex arc. يعني أو it is the pathway of a spinal reflex. Pathway of a spinal reflex. بنبتدي بsensory receptors in the skin. ادي ال modified nerve endings of a sensory neuron وبعدين afferent neuron that carries the information to the spinal cord وبعدين في synapse هنا relay between two neurons another synapse وبعدين efferent neuron وعادة ال efferent neuron ده بيكون motor وmotor هنا مقصود بيها إن هو يا إما هيدي impulse to a muscle to contract يا إما هيدي impulse to a gland to secrete. Okay, this is the pathway of a spinal reflex, and of course you know that it is an involuntary reflex. زي ما انتم شايفين السنسوري نيورونز بيتميزوا بحاجة غريبة جدا. احنا متعودين في الموتور نيورونز ان يكون عندي cell body ويكون عندي axon ويكون عندي terminal branches واحيانا الاكسون بيبقى myelinated like this, leaving unmyelinated parts that are called the nodes of Ranvier وهنا عندي الدندرايتس والدندرايتس بتدخل الimpulses والterminal arborizations بتسند the impulses away. أما السنسوري نيورون زي ما انتم شايفين كده لأنه مضطر ياخد impulses من الريسبتور ويبعتها للسباينال كورد فالسيل بادي ما بيبقاش on one end of the neuron السيل بادي بيبقى في النص كده فاحنا هنلاقي هنا سيل بادي كده وبعدين عندي peripheral branch ناحية الريسبتور وعندي central branch اللي هي ناحية السباينال كورد فالperipheral تجيب الانفورميشن from the sensory receptor والcentral تبعت الانفورميشن زي ما انتم شايفين كده للسباينال كورد فهنا بقى كل السيل بادي طبعا احنا مش بيبقى عندنا one نيورون احنا بيبقى عندنا hundreds of neurons فبيتجمعوا كلهم هنا ويعملوا swelling كده السويلنج ده أنا بسميه ganglion فالganglion ده is a swelling okay that contains a group of cell bodies of sensory neurons or of neurons in general تمام والinterneuron على فكرة مش كل الريفلكس arcs فيها 3 neurons يعني احنا هنا we have 3 neurons we have the afferent neuron we have the sorry I can't see the we have the afferent neuron اللي هم number 1 we have the interneuron we have the efferent neuron يعني كده احنا عندنا 2 synapses a synapse is the place where the terminal end of one neuron ends on the cell body of another neuron فاحنا عندنا 3 neurons in this pathway وعندنا 2 synapses ده بيسلو داون الريفلكس شويه لكن احيانا الريفلكس بيبقى 2 neurons بس يعني الافرنت اهو كده وادي السباينال كورد والافرنت على طول يدي اوردر للمسل او للجلاند يعني هنا مفيش انترنيورون ده بيبقى معمول من 2 نيورونز بس وبيبقى very rapid هنا طبعا الديسندنج موتور باثواي و احنا شايفين الديكاسيشن اهي يعني this is the level of هو واخد section ادي الموتور كورتكس الفايبرز نازله on the same side على فكرة لما تنزل on the same side بنسمي ده ipsilateral يعني on the same side تفضل نازلة في الميد برين وبعدين تنزل في البونز وبعدين تيجي بقى عند الميدولا اوبلونجاتا في البيراميد of the medulla oblongata وتروح للناحية التانية وتبتدي تنزل بقى تعمل اللاترال corticospinal tract الفايبرز دي بقى هسميها contralateral ولو انت عايز مثلا تقول contralateral لو انت عايز مثلا تقول ان في hemiplegia on the other side ممكن تقول there is contralateral hemiplegia. Thank you guys. I hope this was useful and of course you'll be receiving an assignment containing questions about this revision on the nervous system. Thank you so much. See you.